Changing tactics. Soldiers in the field versus the power structure that's supporting the soldiers. Up until the 1700s, warfare had changed little, but gunpowder changed everything. Now you had muskets and cannons. Musketeers would protect the spearmen. Then it was decided to give the muskets, okay, you'd have spearmen protecting the musketeers. Now understand, muskets back then were smooth bored. Being smooth bored, they weren't very accurate, but they should still a force to be reckoned with, fired in mass, a group of men. Now you had musketeers who would be issued spearmen to protect them in hand-to-hand combat, and then someone came up with the idea of, well, why don't we just put a bayonet on the end of a musket? And then the musketeers could protect themselves. So at first, the bayonets tended to be, they could be like 2 feet long, 3 feet long. I mean, they were big. But over time, as the firearms got better, the bayonets got shorter. Also, over time, for the firearms, rifling was introduced, and this made a big difference. Now, instead of being effective at about 60 yards, a musket would be effective about 60 yards, but a rifle would be effective up to about 250 yards, so that made a big difference. Okay, so one of the things that you had happen when you had, for the 1700s, spearmen would typically march in a group, and they'd have their spears together, and they'd be about 18 inches apart, a foot and a half apart, because this was the best spacing for men fighting in a group. See, if men lost their spacing, then they became vulnerable to an enemy attack where they could just run over them. So they trained these guys excessively and endlessly in marching, in keeping about a foot and a half space between each other. And to this day, you march in that formation. I was an infantry rifleman in the U.S. Army. Okay, the thing was massing men in a group, in a formation, started to change with the advent of gunpowder. Now you had things like hand grenades, you had things like artillery and mortars. And massing men together in a group like that just made them an easier target. So now the tactic was to spread men out over an area to make them not so easy a target to firepower. But it's interesting though, because in World War I, at the beginning of the war, men still marched in tight formations towards the enemy, and that just made them easier targets for machine guns, artillery, and mortars, not just to mention rifle fire. Okay, in World War I, fighting was done spread out, not in mass formations, and long bayonets had a tendency to get stuck in an enemy soldier, so while you were trying to pull it out, you could get killed by one of his buddies. So soldiers had blacksmiths make shorter, double-edged blades about 6 inches long that could fit on the end of a rifle. It was less likely to get stuck and less likely to be deflected by a soldier trying to block you with something like a shovel or a trench club or whatever they had. Bright uniforms worked well in the Napoleonic era, but as artillery got better, bright uniforms were an easy target. So soldiers, there was a case in World War I where French soldiers were in these bright uniforms and the German artillery was up on a hill. This was early in the war. And massed men together in bright uniforms like that made an easy target. So they basically got pummeled. They took a beating from German artillery. So soldiers started telling them, look, we need darker uniforms. And it took the chain of command a while, but they finally caught up with that. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting to me because in Vietnam, uh, like in World War One, my grandfather was in that, and he was trained in bayonet fighting extensively, and he had 29 confirmed kills in hand-to-hand combat, but he did it all with a trench club or a trench knife. Here, let me show you. This was a field improvised weapon that was made by soldiers in the rear. You know, they looked something like this. There was no standard trench club, but from what I heard, this is in the ballpark of what one of these might have looked like. And also, he had one of these, the trench knife. And this was designed as a close quarter melee weapon. See, like with the bayonet, there was enough room in a trench to wield a bayonet effectively, so a weapon like this was much more preferable. Yeah, in Vietnam, you had something called the hatchet knife technique. Now, what would happen is that soldiers fighting Vietnam, they were in a similar situation that what they experienced in World War I, where they were in like a jungle formation, a tight formation. There wasn't a lot of room to wield a bayonet. They found a hatchet and a knife actually worked much better in close quarter combat. And the Vietnamese said, yeah, they were much less likely to fight Americans if they saw them with hatchets and knives in close quarter than they were someone coming at them with a bayonet. Yeah, it's interesting also, in the Gulf War, a lot of our communication systems were in poor condition and outdated and unreliable. And we already had technology that was much better than what, was around when the Gulf War came. So a lot of soldiers found themselves using their cell phones to communicate with each other in their chain of command rather than actually using their field radios. Okay. Also, in the American Civil War, near the end, Union soldiers would mail order repeating rifles. Yeah, it took a while for these repeating rifles to be issued to them, but many of them had them before they were issued. And the Confederate soldiers complained that the Yankees would load them on Sunday and then fire them all week. So this is a condition of troops in the field adapting quicker to the situation than their chain of command supporting them is catching up with the learning curve. In World War II, tankers were adding extra armor to their Sherman tanks. Now they'd use logs, concrete blocks, railroad ties, steel, etc., whatever they could get to strap more mass on their tanks for greater armor protection. In the Gulf War, the Second Gulf War, soldiers were adding scrap metal from the junkyard. They were attaching that to the side of their vehicles, like their Humvees, to give themselves also greater protection. So there's always going to be a gap between the soldiers in the field and your chain of command in terms of the learning structure of how to do things. So a good chain of command is one that will embrace change and quickly adapt to the situation in the field. Thank you.